The knock never came. Instead, boots crunched through frost-hard grass, running, stumbling, then running again. A woman in a wedding dress tore through the pines with her veil catching on branches like something trying to hold her back. Behind her, the church bells had stopped ringing 10 minutes ago. Her name was Eleanor Voss, and she was 26 years old, and she was not going to marry Thomas Bellwether. Not today. Not ever, though an hour ago she'd believed she would. The mountain rose ahead of her, dark and patient, and somewhere on it was the only place in Coulter's Ridge where nobody would think to look for a runaway bride. Eleanor's hands were shaking. Not from the cold, though the cold was real enough to bite through silk sleeves never meant for November. She was shaking because 2 hours ago she had been standing at the altar of St. Agnes, watching her father's face for some sign of doubt, and finding none. She had looked at Thomas Bellwether's hands instead. Soft hands. Banker's hands. Hands that had never split a log or pulled a calf from mud, and that had never once, in 8 months of courting, reached for hers without checking first who was watching. The preacher had asked the question. And Eleanor, raised to say yes to everything, had said nothing at all. She had turned. She had walked. Then she had run, her mother's pearl combs falling loose from her hair, her satin shoes soaking through with the first fallen snow of the season. Nobody chased her. That was the strange, cold truth of it. Not her father. Not Thomas. As if some part of the town had already known this dress was borrowed time. The cabin sat at the tree line where the county road gave up and the mountain took over. Smoke curled from its chimney, thin and steady, the only sign of life for 2 miles in any direction. Caleb Wren split wood behind the cabin the way he did most evenings, not because he needed more of it, but because his hands needed something to do that wasn't remembering. He was 34. Broad through the shoulders from 10 years of mountain work. A short beard going gray at the edges though nothing else on him had earned that yet. His eyes were the pale gray of a sky before snow, and they rarely settled on anything for long, as if looking too closely at the world might ask something of him he wasn't ready to give. 3 years since his wife had died. 3 years since he'd built this cabin high enough up the ridge that town gossip couldn't reach him, and the town had obliged by mostly forgetting he existed. He liked it that way. Or told himself he did. The axe came down. The wood split clean. And somewhere below him, past the first stand of pines, something moved that wasn't a deer. Caleb straightened, axe still in hand, and watched. A shape in white, stumbling through undergrowth that would tear a person's feet to ribbon in those thin little shoes. Moving like something being chased, though nothing followed. He set the axe against the chopping block. He did not call out. Calling out to something frightened, he'd learned once, a long time ago, only made it run faster. He waited instead, the way he'd wait for a spooked horse, and let the mountain do what the mountain always did, bring lost things to his door, one way or another. Eleanor didn't see the cabin until she was almost against it. She'd been running with her eyes on the ground, on roots and rocks, on anything that might trip her before the dark finished swallowing the light. When she looked up, there it was, log silvered with age, a porch worn smooth by boots that weren't hers, and a man standing very still beside a woodpile, watching her the way you'd watch weather rolling in. She stopped running. Her breath came out in a single broken sound, half sob, half relief, and her knees nearly gave out on the last of the slope. I didn't mean, she started, and didn't know how to finish it. I didn't mean to end up here. I didn't mean any of this. I didn't mean to leave 100 people standing in a church with their mouths open. The man didn't move toward her. He didn't move away either. He just looked at her the way a person looks at something they're deciding whether to trust, and said, in a voice rough from disuse, "You're not dressed for the mountain." It was such an ordinary thing to say to a woman in a torn wedding gown, shivering in the last gray light of day, that Eleanor almost laughed. Almost cried. Did a little of both. "No," she managed. "I suppose I'm not." Behind her, far down the slope, a lantern bobbed between the trees. Slow. Searching. Someone had finally come looking after all. Caleb's eyes moved past her, to that far-off light, then back to her face, pale, frightened, and set with something he recognized because he'd worn it himself once. The look of a person who has just chosen the harder road and isn't sorry yet. "Come inside," he said. "Before they get here." He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask why she was running, or from whom, or what she'd be walking back into once the sun rose and the mountain had to give her up again. He just opened the door, and stepped aside, and let the firelight fall out across the snow like an answer to a question nobody in Coulter's Ridge had thought to ask her in 8 long months. Eleanor Voss looked once more at the lantern light climbing toward her. Then she walked through the door of a stranger's cabin, and it closed behind her with a sound like a held breath finally let go. The fire had burned down to embers by the time Eleanor stopped shaking. Caleb hadn't spoken since he'd closed the door. He'd only moved, quiet, practical movements, a wool blanket pulled from a trunk near the wall, a kettle set over the coals, his own coat hung on a peg so she wouldn't mistake the offer of the blanket for anything it wasn't. She sat close to the fire in a chair that had clearly been built for someone's hands, not bought from any store. The wood was worn smooth at the arms. Worn the way things got worn when somebody sat in them night after night, thinking. "Whose chair is this?" she asked, before she could stop herself. Something crossed his face, there and gone, like wind moving through wheat. Doesn't matter. It mattered. She could see that much. But she didn't push, because she of all people understood what it was to carry something you weren't ready to hand a stranger. The kettle began to sing. Caleb poured 2 cups without asking if she wanted one, set hers on the small table beside her, and didn't sit down himself. He stood near the window instead, one shoulder against the frame, watching the dark like he expected it to do something. "They'll have called off the search by midnight," he said. "Snow's coming in. Nobody hunts a person through that, not even for a wedding. How do you know there's a search? Man doesn't leave a lantern burning at the base of the ridge for no reason." He glanced at her. "That was your father's man. Recognized the walk." Eleanor's hands tightened around the cup. "You know my father? Everybody up here knows the Voss name. Doesn't mean they know the Voss daughter." He said it plainly, not unkindly, and something about the distinction, that he saw her as separate from the name she'd been born into, loosened something in her chest that had been tight since the church. She told him her name an hour later, after the second cup of coffee, after the wind outside had picked up enough to rattle the shutters. He told her his, Caleb, and nothing more. No stories volunteered. No questions asked in return, though she could feel them sitting behind his eyes, patient, the way a man waits out a storm he knows will pass in its own time. It was the chair that undid her curiosity again. She kept coming back to it, the smoothness of the arms, the way he'd avoided her eyes when she'd asked. "Someone used to sit here," Eleanor said finally. Not a question this time. Caleb was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer at all. "My wife," he said. "Martha. 3 years gone this January." The fire popped. Neither of them filled the silence that followed, and Eleanor understood, in the way you understand things without being told, that this was a man who had built a life around an absence and called it peace. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be. Wasn't your doing." He looked at her properly then, for the first time all evening, gray eyes steady on her face. "Why'd you run?" It was the first question he'd asked her all night, and it landed harder for how long he'd waited to ask it. Eleanor looked down at her ruined shoes, at the hem of a dress that had cost more than most families in Coulter's Ridge saw in a year, and found that the truth came easier here, in this small warm room, than it ever had in her father's house. "Because he checked," she said. "Every time he reached for my hand, in 8 months, he checked first who was watching. Like I was something to be seen holding, not someone to hold." She laughed, short and humorless. "I stood at that altar and realized I couldn't remember a single time he'd looked at only me. There was always someone else in the room he was looking at, too." Caleb didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, quiet, "Martha used to say a man shows you what he loves by what he protects when nobody's grading him for it." Eleanor looked up. "And what did you protect?" He didn't answer that. He only turned back to the window, and this time when he looked out at the dark, she understood it wasn't the search party he was watching for anymore. She woke before dawn to the sound of the axe. Eleanor pulled Caleb's coat tighter around her shoulders. She'd fallen asleep in the chair, and someone, sometime in the night, had draped it over her without waking her, and went to the window. Caleb was already at the woodpile, breath fogging in the gray light, splitting logs with the same steady rhythm as the evening before, as if nothing about the world had changed. As if he hadn't spent half the night sitting across from a runaway bride telling her things about his dead wife he probably hadn't said aloud in 3 years. She watched him for a while. Watched the economy of his movements, the way he never wasted a swing. Watched him pause, once, and press his palm flat against a fence post nearby, an old, weathered post, half collapsed, like the touch meant something she wasn't part of yet. There was a whole life written into this mountain that she couldn't read yet. A whole story in the smoothness of that chair, in the fence post he touched like a wound, in the careful, guarded way he'd answered every question that came too close to the center of him. She was still watching when hoofbeats broke the quiet. Not one horse. 3, maybe 4, coming up the ridge road fast enough to throw Frost from the ground. Eleanor's stomach dropped before her mind caught up to why. Caleb heard them too. He straightened, axe still loose in his hand, and looked toward the tree line with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet, not wariness, not curiosity, but recognition. Like he already knew who was coming, and the knowing cost him something. Eleanor pressed her hand to the cold glass. Through the thinning trees, she saw her father's black gelding first, then her father himself, coat flying open, face carved from granite. And beside him, unhurried, sitting his horse like a man who already knew how this would end. Thomas Bellwether. Caleb hadn't moved from the woodpile. But his knuckles had gone white around the axe handle, and his eyes, when they flicked once toward the cabin window and found Eleanor's face pressed against the glass, held something that hadn't been there the night before. Something that looked almost like recognizing her, too. From somewhere. From before. Eleanor's father dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, boots hitting frozen ground hard enough to crack the frost crust beneath them. Eleanor. Just her name, said the way a man says a name he's been holding in his throat for hours. Get away from that window and come down here. She didn't move. Not yet. Her eyes were still on Caleb, on that flicker of recognition that had passed across his face like a shadow crossing water, gone before she could be sure she'd seen it at all. Thomas stayed on his horse. He hadn't spoken. He was looking at the cabin the way a man looks at a debt he's about to collect, and something about that stillness frightened Eleanor more than her father's shouting ever could. Caleb set the axe down slowly, deliberately, the way you'd set down anything you didn't want mistaken for a threat. "Morning, Harlan," he said to her father, like they'd crossed paths at the mercantile instead of at the edge of a standoff. "She's inside, warm, and safe. Nothing more happened here than coffee and conversation." "I didn't ask what happened," Harlan Voss said. "I asked for my daughter." The cabin door opened. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch in Caleb's coat, her wedding dress torn at the hem, her hair loose and wild from the night, and she had never in her life felt less like the woman who'd stood at that altar and more like herself. "I'm not going back to marry him, Papa." Her voice didn't shake. She was almost surprised by that. "I should have said it in the church. I'm saying it now." Thomas finally spoke, and his voice was smooth in the way that used to comfort her and now only made her skin crawl. "Eleanor. You embarrassed yourself. You embarrassed your father. Come down off this mountain and we'll forget it happened. I'm still willing to marry you." Still willing. As if she were damaged goods he was generously agreeing to take anyway. Caleb's jaw tightened. He said nothing. It wasn't his place to say anything, not yet, not about a matter between a woman and the man she'd almost married, but his hand had moved, without seeming to notice it had, to rest on the porch rail nearest Eleanor, like a fence line drawn without a word. Harlan saw it. His eyes narrowed. "Wren. This isn't your business." "No," Caleb agreed. "It isn't. But she came up my mountain half frozen and running from something, and I wasn't about to leave a woman standing out in the snow just because it wasn't my business." His voice stayed level, but something under it had hardened. "Seems to me the question of whose business this is belongs to her." For a long moment nobody moved. The horses stamped and blew steam into the cold. Somewhere in the pines, a bird called once and fell silent, as if even the mountain was waiting to see which way this would break. Harlan looked at his daughter, really looked, the way Eleanor couldn't remember him looking at her in years, past the wedding and the plans and the alliance with the Bellwether name, to the frightened, resolved young woman standing on a stranger's porch in a torn dress. "Eleanor," he said, quieter now. "Do you understand what you're throwing away?" "I understand what I almost married," she said. "I don't think I understood that until last night." Thomas's horse shifted under him, impatient, and something in his composure finally cracked. "This is absurd. She spent the night alone with a mountain man she's never met, and you're all standing here discussing her feelings." He looked at Caleb with open contempt. "What exactly do you think you're going to offer her? A cabin with no floor half the year and a dead wife's chair to sit in. The words landed like a slap. Eleanor flinched, not for herself, but for Caleb, whose face had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man absorbing a wound without letting it show. "That's enough," Eleanor said, sharp enough that Thomas actually blinked. "You don't get to speak about him. You don't get to speak about anything up here. You lost that right when I realized you'd never once looked at me like I was the only thing in the room." Thomas opened his mouth. Closed it. For the first time since she'd known him, he seemed to understand that the conversation was already over, and had been over since she'd started running. He turned his horse without another word and rode back down the ridge road alone, and something about his straight, offended back told Eleanor that whatever wound this left in him, it would heal into pride long before it healed into anything like grief. Her father lingered. "I'll send the carriage back for you Sunday," he said finally, gruffly, the closest thing to acceptance she was likely to get from him today. "Whatever you decide by then is your business." "Thank you, Papa." He mounted his horse, hesitated, and looked once more at Caleb, a long, measuring look, the look of a man deciding whether to trust his daughter's judgment or override it one more time. Whatever he found in Caleb's face seemed to satisfy something, because he only nodded once, short and stiff, and rode back down the mountain without another word. The sound of hooves faded into the trees. Then there was only the wind, and the smoke rising thin from the chimney, and the two of them standing on a porch that suddenly felt much larger than it had a minute before. "He wasn't wrong," Caleb said finally, not looking at her. "About the floor. About the chair. I don't care about the floor. You should. Winters up here are hard. Harder than anything you've known in that house of your father's." He finally turned to face her, and there was something raw in his expression now, something he'd kept locked away since she'd first stumbled out of the trees. "I haven't let anybody sit in that chair since Martha. Haven't wanted to. Didn't think I'd want to again. And now?" He was quiet for a long moment, weighing the words before he let them out, like a man counting coins he wasn't sure he could spend. "Now I keep thinking about how you looked at that fence post this morning like you already understood there was a story there you hadn't earned yet. Didn't ask. Just waited." He shook his head slightly, almost disbelieving himself. "Nobody's waited on me in 3 years." Eleanor stepped closer, close enough that she could see the gray of his eyes had warmed, just slightly, the way sky does right before the sun breaks through. "I'm not asking you to replace her," she said quietly. "I don't want the chair to mean anything except that it's a chair. I just want—" She stopped, searching for words that wouldn't sound as foolish out loud as they felt in her chest. "I want to be looked at like I'm the only one in the room. That's all I ever wanted." Caleb's hand came up, slow, careful, the same careful way he'd offered her the blanket the night before, like he was still asking permission with every motion, and rested against her cheek, cold from the morning air, rough from years of axe handles and rope and honest work. "You're the only one in the room," he said. "Have been since you came stumbling down that hill in shoes that weren't fit for a garden path, let alone a mountain." She laughed, a real laugh this time, surprised out of her, and something between them settled into place the way frost settles overnight, quiet and complete and impossible to notice happening until you woke to find the whole world changed. Sunday came, and the carriage came with it, waiting patient at the base of the ridge road exactly as Harlan Voss had promised. Eleanor stood on the porch in a borrowed dress, plain wool instead of torn silk, and looked down the slope at the carriage, and then back at the cabin behind her, smoke curling steady from the chimney, the woodpile stacked higher than it had been a week ago, the chair by the fire that had, in 6 short days, quietly become her chair too, without either of them saying so out loud. "You don't have to decide today," Caleb said from the doorway. "Carriage'll wait." "I already decided," she said. "I decided the morning I watched you split wood and thought, I want to know the story behind that fence post. I want to know all your stories, even the ones that hurt to tell." She turned to face him fully. "I'm not running from anything anymore, Caleb. I'm choosing to stay." He didn't say anything grand in return. He wasn't a man built for grand things. He only crossed the porch, took her hand, the first time he'd reached for it without her offering first, and held it the way a man holds something he intends to keep holding, in full view of anyone who cared to see, with nobody left to check for watching. Down the ridge, the carriage waited a while longer. Then, without ever being called for, it turned around and made its slow way back down the mountain, empty. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridgeline and painted the snow the color of embers, Eleanor sat in the chair by the fire, worn smooth at the arms, no longer waiting for anyone else, and Caleb sat in the one across from her, close enough that their knees nearly touched. 2 cups of coffee steamed on the small table between them. Outside, the wind had gone quiet, the way it does when winter finally settles in for good, no longer restless, no longer searching. The lantern in the window burned low and steady, the way it would every night after, for anyone still finding their way up the mountain in the dark.